Have you ever spent decades building a life only to wake up one morning and realize it wasn't yours anymore? Margaret Walker thought she had it all figured out. A stable marriage, a grown son making his way in the world, and a home filled with familiar rhythms. But one ordinary Tuesday, her husband, her partner of 22 years, left her for a younger woman. No warning, no explanation, just silence where promises used to be. What would you do if the foundation of your life suddenly cracked beneath you? Would you fall apart? Or would you find something buried beneath the ruin, something quietly waiting to bloom? In this tender and deeply human story, we follow Margaret as she sifts through the ashes of a life she once knew, only to discover something unexpected herself. Through burnt cookies, soft porch conversations, and windows she never knew were open, she begins to rise, not with rage, but with resilience. This isn't just a story of loss. It's about reclaiming your name, your voice, and the quiet power you forgot you had. If you've ever been broken, questioned your worth, or longed to begin again, this story is for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Now, let's step into Margaret's world. The silverware clinked gently against fine china as candlelight flickered across the long dining table. The roast chicken had long since gone cold. The bottle of Merlot, Margaret's favorite, sat half-finished, untouched since the first pour. Outside, the ocean murmured under a darkening sky, its tide gently brushing the shore of Bellevue's quiet coastline. Inside the Walker home, silence reigned, and Margaret felt it settle around her like a second skin. Ethan stared at her from across the table, his face still handsome, though time had deepened the lines around his mouth, wore a look she couldn't read. Not quite guilt, not quite fear, just distance. The kind that made a 22-year marriage feel like a memory from someone else's life. "I'm leaving," he said, finally. 3 words, flat, efficient, not even dressed in apology. Margaret blinked once, twice. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She simply set her fork down next to her plate with care, as if noise might cause the moment to shatter entirely. "For her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked away. That was all the answer she needed. Crystal Harper, 28, bright, eager, his new assistant until 2 months ago, when Margaret had found a forgotten receipt for a luxury hotel in Charleston, dated the weekend Ethan had supposedly been at a conference in Chicago. He cleared his throat. "It's not just about her. It's, I need to feel alive again. This life, it's not what I want anymore." Margaret studied the man she had once loved with every inch of her being, the man whose career she'd nurtured, whose home she'd built, whose child she'd raised while putting her own dreams on the shelf so he could pursue his. The man who now sat in their dining room with a folder full of divorce papers tucked under his elbow. "You could have said that," she replied, "before you packed up everything you are into someone else." Ethan didn't flinch. Maybe he expected her to rage. Maybe he expected tears. He didn't get either. "Look," he said, his tone shifting to something managerial. "We've been living parallel lives for years. You have your routines, your causes. I have the company. It's not like we've been passionate." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "So you traded me in for passion. Does she even know how you take your coffee, how you shut down when you're overwhelmed. Did she see you the day you lost your father?" He looked down at his hands, avoiding her gaze. Margaret stood. The chair scraped against the hardwood floor, not rudely, just deliberately. She walked to the sideboard, poured herself another splash of wine, and faced the man who'd just detonated her life with one conversation. "Ethan," she said softly, "if you're leaving, make sure it's worth what you're losing." He shifted uncomfortably. "You'll be taken care of. I've had the lawyers draw up a fair—" "Don't," she cut in, firm but calm. "Don't reduce 22 years to a settlement." For a long moment they just stood there, the sound of the sea pressing in through the open window. A breeze stirred the curtains, carrying with it the scent of salt and something final. Then Ethan nodded once. "I'll have my things out by Monday." And just like that, he left. Margaret didn't move for several minutes. She stared at the empty chair across the table, at the candle burning low. She reached for her wine, but set it down before the glass reached her lips. Her hands trembled slightly as she blew out the candle, one by one. When the house fell into complete darkness, she whispered to no one in particular, "So this is how the story turns." The house was quiet, too quiet. Margaret Walker stood in the doorway of the master bedroom, arms crossed over her chest, staring at the dent in the carpet where Ethan's suitcase had rested just 2 days before. It was strange the way absence took up so much space. The closet was half empty now, his tailored shirts and crisp suits gone, leaving only the faint scent of cedar and cologne behind. Even that was starting to fade. She didn't touch anything. Not yet. Some part of her still expected this to be a dream she'd wake from, the kind where the air feels thick and nothing makes sense until morning brings relief. But the sun had risen twice already since he left, and nothing felt lighter. Downstairs, the antique grandfather clock chimed 10. The sound echoed through the high-ceilinged hallway, bouncing off walls that had once heard laughter, arguments, music life. Now it rang hollow, like a bell tolling for something lost. Margaret made her way to the kitchen, her steps measured, deliberate. She filled the kettle, turned the knob on the stove, and watched the flame bloom blue beneath the pot. A cup of tea wouldn't fix anything, but it gave her hands something to do. On the counter sat a stack of unopened mail. The top envelope bore Daniel's handwriting, her son, now 30 and living in Oregon, with his wife and their baby girl. She hadn't had the heart to tell him everything yet. She kept their phone calls cheerful, filtered. She didn't want to burden him. Or maybe she just didn't want to hear the pity in his voice. She opened the letter anyway. "Dear Mom," it began. "Claire sends her love, and little Rosie is starting to walk wobble. Really, but she's determined, just like you." Margaret smiled faintly. Determined. Was that still true? She had once been fierce. In college, she was the kind of woman who debated professors, marched for causes, dreamed of running a nonprofit for single mothers. Then life shifted. She married Ethan, built a life around his ambitions, raised Daniel, put her own dreams on hold so everyone else's could run full steam ahead. It hadn't felt like sacrifice at the time. It had felt like love. Now she wasn't so sure what it had been. The kettle whistled. She poured hot water over a tea bag and carried the mug to the breakfast nook, where morning sun filtered through lace curtains. The cushions on the window seat were faded but soft. She curled up there, knees tucked beneath her, and sipped slowly. She could still hear his voice sometimes. Not the Ethan from this week, the one with the cold eyes and final words. No, she heard the old Ethan, the one who made her laugh in the grocery store aisle, the one who surprised her with lemon bars when she had morning sickness, the one who once told her she was the strongest woman he'd ever met. Funny how those memories could sting more than the betrayal. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window, and Margaret jumped slightly, spilling a drop of tea onto her hand. She set the mug down with a sigh and reached for the pen and notepad resting beside the kitchen phone. She'd been making lists since the night he left groceries, repairs, bills, but now her pen hovered over a blank page. For the first time in years, she realized, the list could be just hers. She wrote, slowly fix the leaky faucet, call the lawyer about the papers, bake something. That last one surprised her. She hadn't baked for herself well, maybe since Daniel went to college. Back then, baking had been an act of love, of connection. These days, it felt like an old coat hung in the back of a closet, forgotten, but familiar. A knock at the front door startled her from her thoughts. She padded barefoot to answer, brushing a stray curl behind her ear. It was Nancy, her neighbor from across the street, holding a small casserole dish. I heard, Nancy said gently. No judgment, just kindness. Figured you didn't want to cook. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. Thank you. They didn't say much. Nancy didn't ask questions, and Margaret didn't offer details. But when the door closed again and she placed the warm dish on the counter, something shifted inside her just a little. Maybe this was what starting over looked like, not with grand gestures or sweeping changes, but with a cup of tea, a casserole from a neighbor, a blank list. She picked up the pen again and added one more item. Remember who you were before him. Outside, the sun climbed higher, casting long beams across the wooden floors of a house that was still hers. The morning air smelled like old wood and lemon-scented floor cleaner. Margaret Walker stood barefoot in the center of her kitchen, holding a worn recipe card in her hand. The handwriting on it was hers sharper, younger, with little hearts above the eyes. At the bottom, a smudge of flour still clung to the corner, stubborn after all these years. She had found it tucked inside a faded cookbook at the back of the pantry, wedged between dog-eared pages and long expired coupons. The recipe, cinnamon walnut scones, her grandmother's favorite. It wasn't just a recipe. It was memory of Saturday mornings in her first apartment, of Daniel clapping his chubby toddler hands as she opened the oven door, of the smell of brown sugar filling a kitchen now long gone. She read through the instructions, eyes moving slowly. It was all still there. Muscle memory hummed beneath her fingertips. She set the card down and reached for the mixing bowl. This time, she wasn't baking for a dinner party, or to impress Ethan's clients, or to fill space at the neighborhood brunch. This time, it was for her. As she moved through the motions measuring flour, cubing cold butter, whisking eggs, her mind wandered. She remembered the heat of the oven in her first real home, the tiny galley kitchen with its squeaky drawer and crooked cabinet. Back then, she had dreamed of starting a small bakery. Crumb and comfort she wanted to call it. She even doodled logos on the back of grocery lists. But life, as it does, had rearranged her dreams into neater piles: Ethan's job, Daniel's school, the mortgage. Her own ambitions had been stored away, like the cookbook she just rediscovered. Now, with her sleeves dusted in flour and hands deep in dough, something inside her began to thaw. The oven beeped. She slid the tray in, closed the door, and leaned against the counter, breathing in the warm scent that bloomed almost immediately. Cinnamon, vanilla, toasting walnuts. It smelled like belonging. A knock at the back door startled her. She wiped her hands and opened it to find Mrs. Langley from 2 houses down. The older woman carried a bag of lemons and wore her usual sun hat, tilted slightly off-center. "I was trimming my Meyer lemon tree and thought of you," she said, eyes twinkling. "Still the best baker on this street." Margaret chuckled. That title might be up for grabs these days. Nonsense! You once made lemon bars so good my husband proposed all over again. Margaret accepted the bag with a smile. "Thank you. I'm actually baking something now. Would you like to try one?" Mrs. Langley's eyebrows lifted. "Well, I wouldn't say no." They sat at the kitchen table, a plate of scones between them, steam still curling from their golden tops. Margaret poured tea while Mrs. Langley took a bite and immediately let out a soft moan of delight. "These are divine," she said. "You ever think of selling these?" Margaret blinked. Selling, of course. The church ladies would eat these up figuratively and literally. "We've got a luncheon next weekend. I could pass your name along if you'd like." It was said so casually, as if it were nothing, but to Margaret it felt like the first invitation back into something she hadn't realized she'd missed purpose. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she sipped her tea, glanced at the empty chair across the table, and then back at Mrs. Langley. "I'll think about it," she said. That night, Margaret stood at the kitchen sink, scrubbing the last mixing bowl as dusk fell outside the window. Her arms ached pleasantly, and her apron was stiff with flour. On the counter sat a list, a new one: drop-off sample scones to the church research cottage, baking laws, call Daniel. The last one made her pause. She hadn't told him anything yet, not really. He still thought she and Ethan were working through things. She hated the thought of worrying him, but the longer she waited, the more the truth felt like something that might break when finally spoken. She dried her hands, picked up the phone, and dialed. Daniel answered on the 3rd ring. His voice was groggy earlier in Oregon. "Hey, Mom, everything okay?" She hesitated. "Actually, no, but I think it will be." There was silence on the line, and then the soft rustle of sheets as he sat up straighter. "Talk to me." So she did. She told him about Ethan, about Crystal, about the dinner, the papers, the emptiness that followed. And then she told him about the scones, about Mrs. Langley, about the tiny flickering idea that maybe, just maybe, she could build something new. Daniel didn't interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "I always knew you were magic in the kitchen," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "But I never thought you'd need to be this strong." "I didn't think I could be," she whispered. "Well, you are." After they hung up, Margaret turned off the kitchen lights, slipped out the back door, and sat on the porch steps with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Above her, the stars blinked through the night sky, not loud, not grand, just quietly there, and for the first time in weeks, so was she. Margaret Walker never enjoyed mirrors, not even when she was young, when her skin was smooth and her eyes hadn't learned the weight of silence. She always found them too honest, too quick to reflect the pieces of herself she wasn't ready to meet. That morning, though, she stood in front of the full-length mirror in her bedroom, barefoot on the hardwood floor, and didn't look away. The woman who stared back at her had streaks of gray running through her chestnut hair, pulled back in a loose bun. Her robe hung off one shoulder, soft from too many wash cycles. Her eyes were rimmed with the kind of tired that didn't come from poor sleep, but from the slow unraveling of a life once built on certainty. But they were still clear, still alive. She stepped closer. There were lines around her eyes, along her mouth, beneath the curve of her neck, evidence of laughter, grief, years of holding things together without ever really naming the weight. Her body had changed, softened in places, hardened in others, but it was hers. Every part of it told a story she was no longer ashamed to read. Margaret placed a hand against her own reflection. "Who are you without him?" she whispered. The question floated in the air, unanswered. She thought about the Margaret she used to be before Ethan, before Bellevue, before Daniel, a young woman in denim skirts and bookstore sweaters, full of ideas and grit, always with ink-stained fingers and flour on her jeans. That girl had been bold, reckless sometimes, but real. She missed her. The day unfolded slowly. Margaret baked another batch of scones, packed them neatly into a paper box tied with twine, and dropped them off at the church's back kitchen as promised. The ladies there, volunteers with busy hands and kind eyes, thanked her and made noises of delight when they peeked inside. Back home, the house was still quiet, but less oppressive now. The silence had softened, as if learning to make room for her. She folded laundry, organized bills, and called her lawyer to begin sorting through the paperwork Ethan had left behind. She didn't cry, didn't flinch, just listened, took notes, and nodded. Later, while rummaging through the hall closet for an old pie dish, she found a dusty shoebox labeled Crumb and Comfort. Her breath caught. It was the name of the bakery she'd once dreamed of. Inside were sketches, menus, a list of potential names, even a brochure draft she had written in her 20s. It felt like discovering a time capsule. She sat on the floor, cross-legged, leafing through those pages. Somewhere between the drawings of storefronts and pie pricing, she felt the sting of tears, but they didn't come from sorrow. They came from recognition. That afternoon, Margaret went for a walk. Bellevue's coastal breeze was sharp in early spring, brushing against her skin like a nudge forward. She passed families in front yards, a dog barking from a porch, and the scent of fresh-cut grass. She waved to neighbors, some of whom gave her the kind of smile that said, "I've heard, but I'm with you." It was strange to be truly seen for the first time in years, back home. She set the box from the closet on the kitchen table. She opened her laptop, Googled North Carolina cottage food law, and began reading regulations, permits, labeling. It was overwhelming, but also invigorating. The doorbell rang. When she answered, it was Henry Lawson. She hadn't seen him in over 15 years, maybe longer. They'd been in college together. He was a friend. Once, maybe something more. But timing never aligned. He had moved away, married, lost his wife to cancer 5 years ago. Now he was back in Bellevue, helping his sister settle their parents' estate. Henry stood on her porch in a flannel shirt and worn jeans, holding a brown paper bag. "I heard you made cinnamon scones," he said with a crooked grin. "Thought I'd barter for one." Margaret blinked, surprised, then smiled. "And what's in the bag? Fresh eggs from my sister's hens." They sat on the porch, sipping tea and eating scones from paper napkins. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky with soft gold and pale blue. Their conversation meandered memories, lost time, simple things. "You seem different," Henry said at one point, not unkindly. Margaret looked down at her hands. "Maybe I'm becoming who I was supposed to be." He nodded. "It suits you." When he left, she stood at the door for a while, watching his truck disappear down the road. The wind picked up, rustling the oak trees in the front yard. She pulled her robe tighter around her shoulders and stepped back inside. That night, before bed, she returned to the mirror. The woman there didn't look younger, but she looked real. The Bellevue Saturday market bustled with life. Children tugged on their parents' sleeves, begging for kettle corn or fresh squeezed lemonade. Folk music drifted from the center square where a local band played under a string of faded pennants. The scent of grilled sausages mingled with the aroma of fresh flowers, soap, and cinnamon. Margaret Walker stood behind a small folding table draped in a cream linen cloth, trying not to fidget with her sleeves. Her hands smelled like sugar and nutmeg, and her car still carried the warm scent of the muffins and scones she had baked before dawn. This was her first time selling, not giving, not gifting, selling. She had woken up at 4:30 nerves tingling in her fingers, and baked with a kind of focus she hadn't felt in decades. Each batch of blueberry muffins, lemon poppy seed scones, and cinnamon rolls had come out just right fluffy centers, golden crusts, brushed with honey-buttered glaze. Henry had helped her load up the car. He'd even carried her table and boxes to her tiny corner at the edge of the market, near the booth selling hand-knit scarves. When she thanked him, he simply smiled and said, "You're the one with the courage today." Now, 2 hours in, she had only sold a handful of items. People stopped, smiled politely, sampled a bite, then moved on. She tried to remind herself that starting small was still starting. Mid-morning sun glinted off the tops of her clear pastry containers. Margaret brushed crumbs off her apron, repositioned her handwritten sign, "Sunrise Crumbs, homemade with heart," and forced herself to smile. "You should charge more," a woman with a stroller said after tasting a lemon muffin. Margaret blinked. I I just wanted to keep things accessible." "Well, sweetheart, this tastes like my childhood. That's worth more than $2. The woman walked away, leaving Margaret half laughing, half shaken. At noon, when the crowd grew thick and noisy, a young woman in a mustard-colored cardigan approached her table, holding her phone high. "Hi, I'm Becca. I run the Bellevue Bites Instagram page. Do you mind if I take a photo of your booth? Your whole setup is adorable." Margaret blinked. "Oh, of course. Becca snapped a few pictures, then asked to try a scone. One bite in, her eyes widened. This is This is divine. You made these. Margaret nodded. Okay, I'm posting about you today. This stuff needs to be known. She didn't think much of it at first. Young people were always posting, always tagging, always moving on. But an hour later, the shift was tangible. 3 women stopped by saying, "We saw you on Bellevue Bites 1. Teen asked, 'Do you have gluten-free?' My mom said she's coming later. A man in a flannel shirt bought 6 muffins and said, 'My wife says your pastries are a new form of therapy.' By the time Margaret packed up at 2 p.m., nearly every item was gone. She had a small tin of cash and a dozen people who asked where they could find her next weekend. As she walked back to her car, boxes stacked neatly in her arms, her heart beat, not with panic, but something close to pride. When she got home, she made herself a cup of tea, sat on the back porch, and counted the day's earnings. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more than she expected, enough to cover groceries and a bit toward next month's mortgage. But more than that, it felt earned. Daniel called that evening. She told him everything: the booth, the slow start, the Instagram boost. He laughed. "Mom, you're basically going viral." She rolled her eyes. It was just a few pictures. Still, that's a huge deal. I'm proud of you. Later, Henry stopped by with a box of fresh strawberries and 2 coffee cups. Saw your booth had a crowd when I left, he said, handing her a cup. It got busy. A girl with a phone did more for me than years of baking ever did. He chuckled. Welcome to 2025. They sat on her front porch steps again, sipping coffee and sharing a plate of leftover cinnamon rolls. I almost didn't go, she admitted after a while. This morning, I stood in the kitchen and told myself I was being ridiculous. 54 years old, out here trying to start something. Henry looked at her, his eyes steady. You didn't start today, Margaret. You just picked up where you left off. She didn't reply right away, but his words stuck with her. That night, she opened a new notebook. Page 1. She wrote in careful, tidy letters, "Sunrise crumbs, a beginning, not a comeback." The view from Ethan Walker's penthouse was as spectacular as ever, an uninterrupted sweep of downtown Charlotte's glass towers and the blue smudge of distant mountains. It was the kind of view people fought over in real estate bidding wars. But this morning, it felt like a painting hung too high on a wall. Beautiful, yes, but unreachable. Ethan stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, coffee in hand, jaw tight. Behind him, silence clung to the air, broken only by the occasional shuffle of bare feet against marble tile. Crystal Harper, 28, flawless and polished as ever, wandered in from the bedroom. She wore one of his button-down shirts, loosely tied at the waist, and held her phone like it was part of her anatomy. "You didn't come to bed," she said, voice flat. "I was working." She did impress him. She rarely did any more. Ethan sipped his coffee. It tasted bitter. His phone buzzed with a string of notifications. Most were from the office urgent emails from the finance team, meeting reschedules, one from the legal department with a subject line he didn't dare open just yet. The company was bleeding money. 2 bad investment calls and a partner who bailed last quarter had shaken the board's faith. He'd been trying to patch the holes, hold everything together with duct tape and charm. But the charm wasn't landing like it used to. The board was asking questions. The whispers had started. Maybe it's time for new leadership. Crystal wandered into the kitchen and began scrolling through her phone. "There's a new art exhibit opening this weekend," she said, not looking up. "We should go." Ethan didn't respond. A beat later, she asked, "Did you hear me? I heard," he said sharply, setting his coffee down harder than he meant to. Crystal flinched. "You've been snapping a lot lately. Maybe because I have a company to save." He snapped back, then instantly regretted it. She narrowed her eyes. "Don't take this out on me. I didn't ask to be part of your midlife crisis." The words hit harder than she intended, or maybe she meant them that way. Ethan turned back toward the window, breathing slow. He didn't apologize. That was the thing with Crystal. What once had felt fresh and validating had begun to sour. It wasn't her fault, not entirely, but the glitter had worn off. She didn't know his history. She didn't ask about the nights he'd pulled all-nighters to build the company, or the years Margaret held their life together so he could chase clients. He thought about Margaret more than he'd like to admit. At first, he was sure she'd crumble, that she'd sell the house, disappear into some quiet town, maybe call Daniel in tears, needing help. Instead, she'd started baking. Baking! It would have been laughable if not for the fact that her face had started showing up on social media. Someone had tagged her pastries "sunrise crumbs" or something quaint like that. Then another post followed, and another. A photo popped up in his feed by accident. Becca's post from Bellevue Bites. Margaret, smiling, in an apron, surrounded by customers. She looked different, lighter. He'd stared at that photo for a long time. Something in his chest had twisted, unfamiliar and unwelcome. Not jealousy, not exactly, but something close. It wasn't that she was succeeding, it was that she didn't look like she missed him. The front door opened, startling them both. A delivery man walked in, too confident, too casual, and dropped a box on the kitchen island. Ethan frowned. "Who ordered something?" Crystal shrugged. "I did. It's a limited edition sculpture from that artist I told you about." Ethan stared at the package, $1,000 indulgence. He said nothing, but inside something cracked. When the delivery guy left, Crystal turned to him. "You've been different lately." "So have you," he replied without inflection. She blinked, then smiled tightly. "Well, maybe we should take a break. Give you time to fix whatever's falling apart." He met her gaze, and for the first time in months, he didn't try to convince her to stay. "Maybe you're right." She nodded, walked to the bedroom, and returned 10 minutes later with a small suitcase and her phone tucked into her pocket. No drama, no tears, just silence, and the soft click of the door as it shut behind her. Ethan sank onto the couch. He looked around the penthouse, the pristine kitchen no one cooked in, the designer couch no one really sat on, the wall of awards and framed stock certificates that suddenly felt like museum pieces. He had everything, except the one thing he thought he could walk away from without consequence. Later that night, when the city had quieted and the lights flickered like stars below his window, Ethan sat alone in the dark, scrolling through Margaret's website. The home page was simple: a soft yellow background, a handwritten logo, and one line of text made with hands that remember. He closed the laptop and leaned back, eyes heavy. The silence didn't feel like peace anymore. It felt like judgment. The smoke alarm screamed through Margaret Walker's kitchen like a banshee. She waved a dish towel at the ceiling, coughing as the sharp scent of burnt sugar filled the air. The tray of double chocolate chip cookies on the counter was a dark, unrecognizable mess, edges charred, centers sunken. She stood there, stunned. Then she did something she hadn't done since Ethan left. She swore, out loud, not violently, but honestly, from the gut. Margaret yanked open the window above the sink. Cool coastal air rushed in, pushing the smoke out in waves. She tossed the tray onto the stovetop, peeled off her oven mitts, and sat down hard at the kitchen table. Her hands trembled. Not from the smoke, from frustration. This had been a big order. A new cafe in Bellevue. The clay mug had reached out after hearing about her at the market. The owner, a young woman named Tessa, had offered her a weekly contract: muffins, cookies, scones, whatever she wanted to bake. Margaret had been thrilled and terrified. The night before, she'd barely slept. She reread recipes, measured ingredients twice, triple-checked her oven settings. But the pressure had gotten into her hands, and the cookies, her signature comfort treat, had failed her. She buried her face in her apron, breathing slowly. The kitchen was quiet again. The silence, once soothing, now pressed against her like judgment. You're too old to start over. You're a baker, not a businesswoman. This is a fluke. You don't belong here. She heard every one of those voices. Some sounded like Ethan, some like her own. She stood up and moved slowly to the trash, scraping the blackened cookies into the bin. Each one landed with a dull thud. Each one felt like a bruise. Just then, the phone rang. It was Daniel. She hesitated, then picked up. "Hey, Mom." His voice, warm and familiar, softened something in her chest. "I burned the cookies," she said without greeting. "Every single one." He paused. "The big order." She nodded, forgetting he couldn't see her. He exhaled. "That sucks, but it's okay. It happens. Not when you're trying to prove you deserve a seat at the table." Daniel was quiet for a beat. "You already earned the table. Mom, this is just—" "Spilled coffee on the cloth?" She laughed weakly. Then he added, "Remember when I set the microwave on fire trying to make popcorn? How could I forget? You nearly took out the whole kitchen." "Yeah, and you told me. Mistakes are just proof you're in motion. Still have that written on my whiteboard." Margaret closed her eyes. "I was faking confidence back then," she admitted. "I was scared. I didn't know what I was doing raising you, holding everything together. I was just hoping you wouldn't notice." "I did notice," he said gently. "And I thought you were the bravest person alive." Tears burned her eyes. "I still do." After the call, she cleaned the kitchen in silence, moving slower this time, more deliberately. She wasn't rushing to fix things, just reclaiming space. Later that evening, there was a knock at the door. Henry Lawson stood on the porch, holding a paper bag. "I brought soup," he said. "Thought you might forget to eat." Margaret stepped aside, let him in, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't put on a brave face. I messed up an order, she said, placing 2 bowls on the table. Burned it. All of it. He sat down. Then, you're officially in business? She raised an eyebrow. First failure means you're past the dreaming stage, he said with a small smile. Now it's real. They ate quietly, the warm broth easing her nerves. Afterward, Henry helped her pack up what was salvageable, some muffins, a batch of scones, a small box of lemon bars. It wasn't the full order, but it was something. He loaded the boxes into her car without saying much, just humming a tune she couldn't quite place. "You're not broken, Margaret," he said as she slid into the driver's seat. "You're just a little burnt around the edges." She looked at him, startled, then smiled. "Like my cookies." He winked. Exactly. That night, she delivered the partial order to the clay mug. Tessa, the cafe owner, accepted the boxes with grace. "We all have off days," she said, unbothered. "Just keep baking. Your scones are still the best thing I've tasted this year." Margaret drove home under the soft glow of the moon. Windows cracked open to the spring air. She felt tired, but not defeated. This wasn't the end. This was seasoning. The email arrived late Tuesday evening. Subject line: "Let's talk." Ethan Margaret Walker stared at the glowing screen of her laptop, the blinking cursor beneath those 3 words feeling louder than it had any right to be. She hesitated, then clicked. It wasn't long. Ethan never was one for flowery language. "Margaret, I've been following your bakery. Impressive what you've done in such a short time. I have an idea, business-related. I'd like to help you expand. Think of it as an investment. Let's talk over lunch. My treat." "Ethan." She leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled beneath her chin. "Investment." That word landed like a stone in her stomach. She didn't reply right away. 2 days later, they sat across from each other at a high-end bistro in downtown Bellevue. The kind of place Ethan used to take clients, where the waiters wore pressed vests and poured sparkling water as if it were wine. Ethan looked exactly the same, and yet not. The sharp suit was in place, the Rolex glinting on his wrist, but the confidence was forced. There were creases in his brow she didn't remember, and his eyes scanned the room too often, like a man searching for something to anchor him. Margaret wore her soft navy cardigan, her hair tied back simply, flower still beneath one fingernail. She hadn't dressed for power. She dressed for truth. "Thank you for meeting me," Ethan said, sipping from his glass. "You said it was business," she replied. "So, let's talk." He smiled faintly, trying charm. It didn't land. "I've been thinking," he began. "You've created something incredible. The buzz around Sunrise Crumbs. It's real. You could do more with it. More locations. More reach." Margaret said nothing, letting him continue. "I've got connections, investors. You wouldn't have to front anything. I'd back it financially, provide guidance. Think of it like a partnership." There it was. A proposal, not romantic, not nostalgic, transactional. Margaret stirred her tea slowly, then looked up. "Why?" He blinked. "What do you mean? Why now?" "Why me?" Ethan leaned back. "Because you're good at this, and because I want to help." "No," she said calmly. "You want to own a piece of something you didn't build." The table went quiet. Ethan's jaw tensed. "That's not fair. It's accurate." He glanced around, then leaned forward. Margaret, this isn't about the past. It's about opportunity. You have momentum, yes, but scaling is tough. Most small businesses fail within 5 years. I'm offering you a safety net. She met his eyes. I lived for 22 years as your safety net. I'm not going back. He looked genuinely taken aback. This isn't personal, but it is, she said softly. You think money fixes everything, that you can buy your way into meaning. But this bakery isn't about capital. It's about reclaiming something I gave away for too long. Ethan's voice dropped. I'm trying to be generous here. And I'm asking you to be honest. A pause. Then, in the quietest voice he'd used all lunch, he said, I thought if I helped, maybe you'd need me again. The confession stunned them both. Margaret inhaled deeply, not from anger, but from something else. Pity, and also release. I don't need saving. Ethan, she said, especially not by the man who watched me disappear and never once asked why. His face crumbled just slightly. Not enough for others to notice, but enough for her to see. She stood, smoothing her cardigan. The bakery isn't for sale. Neither am I. As she walked away, the waiter approached with the check. Ethan waved him off silently, staring at the empty seat across from him. Margaret stepped into the sunlight outside, blinking as the brightness greeted her like an old friend. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel smug. She felt steady. Later that night, she shared the story with Henry over coffee. He raised an eyebrow. He really tried to buy his way back in. She nodded, with the best of intentions, I think, but intentions don't change what it would have cost me. Henry stirred his drink. So what now? I go back to baking, she said simply. Back to being mine. He grinned. Then let's celebrate. I brought strawberry jam. They toasted with warm toast and laughter. And for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt entirely untethered from the life she had once called hers. Not lost, but free. The first note arrived tucked beneath a box of strawberries. Margaret Walker found it early one morning on her back porch, where Henry often left produce from his sister's garden. She was used to it by now: bags of tomatoes, bundles of herbs, the occasional carton of eggs. But that morning, the box of berries had a folded piece of paper tucked into one corner. In simple, unhurried handwriting, it read, "They remind me of the summer you wore that red scarf and laughed so hard you spilled lemonade on your shoes. Thought these might bring the memory back." Margaret stared at the note for a long moment, then smiled. She remembered that summer. They were 22. She had worked a farmer's market stand, and Henry played guitar nearby for tips and smiles. He had worn that awful straw hat. She'd made fun of it for weeks. She had forgotten that moment, but he hadn't. She kept the note. A week later, another delivery came this time, a jar of honey and another note. Did you know bees communicate by dancing? Seems fitting. I think your muffins might be doing the same. Margaret found herself laughing out loud, alone in her kitchen. The notes weren't flirtatious, not in the way Ethan's had once been. They were quiet, thoughtful, like someone remembering her without asking for anything in return. She didn't respond right away, not with words. Instead, she dropped off a loaf of orange cardamom bread at Henry's place, wrapped in a cloth napkin with a sprig of lavender. No note, just a gesture. The next day, she received a poem, handwritten, tucked into a book he'd borrowed from the library and left on her porch. This isn't about romance or grand declarations. It's about standing beside someone when the lights are off and the kitchen still smells of cinnamon. Her eyes stung when she read it, not because it was dramatic or sweeping, but because it wasn't, and somehow that made it more honest than anything she'd received in years. One Sunday afternoon, after the market closed, Henry found her sitting on a bench near the town's old fountain, a container of leftover pastries beside her. She gestured to the spot next to her. "If you're looking for bribes, I've got a few lemon squares left." He sat. "I've got something better." He handed her a plain envelope. Inside was a photograph, old, slightly faded. It was the two of them at a college open mic night. She was mid-laugh, leaning forward on a stool, flour on her jeans even then. He stood behind her with his guitar, looking at her instead of the audience. "I forgot this existed," she whispered. "I didn't," he said softly. "You looked like the world hadn't convinced you to shrink yet." She didn't know what to say. So, she didn't say anything. He continued, "I'm not trying to rush anything. Margaret, I just want you to know this is enough for me, sitting on a bench, sharing pastries, remembering who we were, watching who you're becoming." She turned to him, eyes glossy. "What if I'm still figuring it out? Then I'll wait," he replied. "Not for some version of you to appear, just alongside you. As you find her." There was no kiss, no swelling music, just the quiet echo of water in the fountain behind them, and two people leaning into a silence that finally felt like home. Later that night, Margaret found herself writing for the first time in years. Not recipes, not lists, a letter, not addressed to anyone, not really, just to herself, or perhaps to the version of her that used to wonder what came after the kind of heartbreak that could hollow out your bones. You survived, you let the world shake you, and you didn't break, you scattered. And now, piece by piece, you are gathering what's left, not to return to who you were, but to become something quieter, truer, stronger than anyone expected. She folded it gently and placed it inside her recipe box, a different kind of love letter to herself. It was a Thursday morning when the past came to Margaret Walker's front door. She had just finished her second cup of coffee, flour still on her forearms from the early baking shift, when the knock came firm, deliberate, not like Henry's gentle tap, not like Daniel's rapid rhythm on video calls. This knock carried weight. She opened the door slowly, and there he was. Ethan, not in a suit, not polished or poised. He looked tired. His shoulders slumped in a way she'd never seen before. There was a duffel bag at his feet, scuffed at the edges, and his hair looked like he'd run his hands through it too many times. "Hi," he said. Margaret didn't reply at first. She stared at him, the ghost of a life she'd finally stopped grieving. "I was in town," he added awkwardly. "I didn't know where else to go." "You have hotels," she said calmly. He nodded. "I'm not asking to stay. I needed to see you. Talk." She studied him for a long moment before stepping aside. "You have 5 minutes." They sat at the kitchen table, the same one he'd once leaned across to say he was leaving. Now he leaned forward with empty hands. No prepared lines. I lost the apartment. Ethan began. Margaret blinked. The penthouse. He nodded. And the board pushed me out 2 weeks ago. Said they needed younger leadership, a fresh vision. His voice carried no bitterness, just fatigue. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "I thought I was building something unshakable," he said softly. "Turns out everything I poured myself into was made of glass." Margaret sipped her coffee, letting the silence linger. "I wasn't ready to be alone," he admitted. "Crystal left. Turns out she didn't want to be the fallback plan for a man whose golden years were fading." Margaret didn't flinch. She simply set her cup down. "You were never alone," she said. "You just stopped recognizing the people who stood beside you." He looked up at her then, eyes red-rimmed. "I made a mess of it. All of it." "Yes," she said. "You did." He nodded. "I thought maybe there was still something left between us, that maybe time could heal." Margaret leaned back, folding her arms. "Ethan, I forgave you the moment I realized your betrayal wasn't about me. It was about your fear." "But forgiveness doesn't come with a house key." His face crumpled slightly. "I'm not angry," she continued. "I'm not waiting for you to come back, or hoping for a second chance. What we had is over. It ended long before you walked out that door." Ethan lowered his gaze. "I just wanted to say it out loud, that I'm sorry, that you didn't deserve it." "I know," she said gently, "but you needed to say it more than I needed to hear it." He nodded again. "I'll go now." Margaret walked him to the door. As he reached for the handle, she stopped him. "Ethan," he turned, "I hope you find peace, not in a deal, or a woman, or a view from a window, but in the quiet parts, the ones you keep trying to outrun." He swallowed hard. "Thank you." She closed the door behind him. That night, she sat with Henry on the back porch, their usual mugs in hand. "He came back," she said. Henry didn't react, just sipped his tea. "He's not staying." She added, "I figured." He said, "You okay?" "I am," she said. "Surprisingly, I think I've been preparing for that moment since the day he left. And now it just feels done." Henry nodded. "You don't need to explain it to me. You don't owe anyone a story that ends neatly." Margaret leaned her head on the porch rail, looking up at the stars. "I'm not looking for neat," she said. "I'm looking for real." Henry reached over and gently took her hand. "No rush," he said, and she believed him. For once, no part of her wanted to escape, fix, or justify. She didn't need to rewrite the past. She had survived it, and now she was writing something new. Margaret Walker had always believed that life closed doors for a reason, but what no one ever told her was that sometimes, when a door shut softly behind you, a window opened by itself quietly, without ceremony, as if it had been waiting all along. It was Saturday morning when she first noticed the change. The sun poured in through the kitchen window at a slightly different angle, catching the glass jars on her spice rack and turning them into tiny stained glass lanterns. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't rushing. There was no looming order, no ticking timer, no voices in her head urging her to prove anything. Just cinnamon in the air, soft jazz playing in the background, and her hands kneading dough slowly, like a meditation. It was the kind of quiet she used to dread, Now it felt like breath. Outside, the town of Bellevue buzzed gently with spring energy. Children rode bikes in cul-de-sacs. An old couple walked hand in hand past her porch. The hum of Saturday life carried on comfortable, present, grounded. Henry arrived mid-morning, as he often did, with 2 cups of coffee and a newspaper under his arm. "Morning." "Stranger," he said with a small grin. Margaret chuckled. "You brought the good coffee. Didn't you always?" They sat on the porch swing, the wood creaking just slightly as it rocked them into rhythm. Margaret sipped her drink and glanced at the paper tucked beside him. "Anything good in there?" she asked. He handed her the arts section, folded open. A small headline caught her eye. "Local baker named finalist for Carolina Small Business Rising Star." She blinked. There, in full color, was a photo of her booth at the Bellevue Market. Margaret, mid-laugh, reaching across the table with a plate of scones. The article praised Sunrise Crumbs as a symbol of resilience, community, and homemade hope. She turned to Henry, stunned. "Did you know about this?" He sipped his coffee, entirely too innocent. "I might have submitted your name, along with a dozen 5-star reviews, and a few notes from Becca's followers." Margaret laughed, full and deep. "You conspired." "I advocated," he said, placing a hand over his heart. "Big difference." She looked down at the article again. The photo didn't show a woman rebuilding. It showed a woman already risen. Later that day, while organizing her pantry, she found a small box she hadn't opened in years. Inside were clippings, old recipes, business plans, a faded Polaroid of a building she once dreamed of buying. It was dusty, but not dead. Margaret carried it to the kitchen and laid everything out on the table, piece by piece, like puzzle fragments waiting to belong. She grabbed a notebook and started making notes. The difference now, she wasn't building for someone else's dream. She was building for hers. That evening, as dusk softened the town into pastel tones, Margaret and Henry took a walk. Nothing special, just through the winding trail behind the neighborhood, where wildflowers pushed through the cracks and the scent of pine hung heavy in the air. They talked about everything and nothing, about Daniel's latest promotion, about Mrs. Langley's overly ambitious garden project, about the town fair coming in June. At one point, Henry stopped and turned to her. "Do you ever think about the bakery as something more permanent?" Margaret tilted her head. "You mean a building?" He nodded. "Maybe even that little brick place on Main." "The one next to the bookstore." She smiled. "I've thought about it. Sometimes. But it's a leap." He nodded again. "So was starting. And look where you are now." They stood there, beneath a canopy of budding trees, not as people waiting for life to happen, but as people choosing it. Margaret reached for his hand. "Let's go look at it tomorrow." Henry grinned. "First step towards something new." "No," she said softly, squeezing his fingers, "towards something that was always waiting." That night, before bed, Margaret stood by the open window in her bedroom. The breeze was gentle, brushing her cheek like a whisper. She didn't feel like someone starting over anymore. She felt like someone arriving. The building on Main Street had been empty for years. A narrow brick facade, weather-worn and dust-streaked, sat wedged between a second-hand bookstore and an antique shop that smelled perpetually of lavender and old wood. Most people passed it without noticing, but Margaret Walker didn't pass it anymore. She paused outside on a Monday morning in late spring, her keys cool in her palm, sunlight filtering through the leaves above. A handwritten sign hung on the door, "Coming soon, sunrise crumbs, baked with heart." She took a breath and stepped inside. The interior was still in progress, shelves half painted, counters being installed, the faint hum of a sander in the back where Henry worked, covered in sawdust and joy. The walls were soft yellow, sunlight catching the freshly polished floor. The air already smelled faintly of vanilla, as if the space had been waiting for her. There was no grand opening yet, no banners, no ribbon to cut, just Margaret, a checklist in hand, a heart full of quiet pride, and a window left open to let the breeze in. The first real day came a week later. She opened the door at 6 a.m., light still stretching across the town's rooftops. The display case gleamed. Rows of scones, muffins, and cinnamon rolls waited patiently behind glass. The chalkboard sign out front read, "Today's special, lemon and lavender morning buns." Margaret wore her apron blue linen, tied tight, and a smile that felt different than before. Not polite, not tentative, rooted. By 7 the first customer walked in, a retired teacher from Daniel's old school. Then came a mother with twins in tow, their noses pressed to the glass. Then a young man from the bookstore who asked shyly if she offered tea cakes like his grandmother used to make. By noon, the cafe was alive. Laughter bubbled in corners. Conversation spilled across tables. The door chimed every few minutes with someone new, someone curious, someone grateful. Margaret moved through it all with ease, pouring coffee, refilling trays, smiling not for approval, but because the joy was real. Henry dropped by mid-afternoon, leaning against the counter with a warm grin and 2 coffees. "You've created something." "Margaret," he said, offering one to her. She took it. "Feels like coming home." He raised his cup to new homes. That evening, after the final scone had been sold and the chairs were tucked in, Margaret stood alone in the quiet space, mop in hand. The smell of cinnamon still lingered. So did something else. Hope, not the wild, desperate hope she used to carry, but a deeper kind. The kind born from showing up day after day, even when things cracked and failed. The kind that grows through silence, nourished by every small decision to try again. She lit a candle near the window, a simple ritual, not for ambiance, for gratitude. Later that night, Daniel called. "I saw the photos on Becca's page." He said, "The shop looks amazing. Mom, wish you were here. I'll come visit next month." He promised. "Bring someone with me, actually." Margaret's heart warmed. "You're seeing someone." He laughed. "Yeah, she's the patient kind. Reminds me a little of you." She smiled. "That's a dangerous compliment." They talked a while longer, about little things, big things, life. Before hanging up, he said, "You're really doing it. You know, you didn't just survive, you bloomed." Margaret looked around the space, quiet and glowing. "Maybe we all do, eventually," she said, "when the soil's finally ours." 1 week later, a letter arrived in her mailbox, no return address. Inside was a photograph. Margaret, standing behind her booth at the Bellevue Market, her face flushed from laughter, sunlight catching the edge of her hair. On the back was written, "The woman in the mirror was always this radiant." She just needed to turn the lights back on. She placed it on the bakery's front counter, next to the register, not hidden, not flaunted, just there, like truth. The weeks that followed folded into a rhythm: early mornings, full afternoons, evening walks with Henry, and quiet moments of reflection. The town embraced her bakery like an old friend. Customers returned not just for her baked goods, but for the feeling they left with: comforted, seen, remembered. Sunrise Crumbs became more than a shop. It became a reminder that healing doesn't always come loud, that sometimes strength grows in the pauses, that love, true love, isn't always romantic. Sometimes it's found in a kitchen bathed in early light, in the pages of old recipes, in flour-dusted hands and second chances. And on one particular morning, long after the town had come to know her name again, Margaret opened her shop, took her usual spot behind the counter, and looked out the front window. The sun was rising, and so was she. Sometimes starting over isn't about beginning again. It's about remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. Margaret's story reminds us that no matter how late it feels in life, growth and healing are still possible. We may lose people, status, or even parts of ourselves along the way. But what truly defines us isn't what we've lost, it's what we choose to rebuild. For many of us in later stages of life, there's a quiet temptation to believe our best chapters are behind us. But this story gently whispers otherwise. It tells us that strength can come from stillness, that love doesn't have to be loud to be real, and that joy, true, earned joy, can still find us, even in the most unexpected seasons. So, if you've ever felt like the world moved on without you, take heart. The sunrise doesn't ask how old you are. It just shows up. And maybe, just maybe, there's a window still waiting to open in your life, too. Let Margaret's journey be a gentle reminder. It's never too late to return to yourself. Thank you for spending your time with us and sharing in Margaret's journey. If this story touched your heart, made you reflect, or simply reminded you that hope still lives in quiet corners, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing meaningful, healing stories to life. Until next time, take gentle care of your heart.